Hi, Danny. How are you?
Good, Mazir. How are you?
Good, thank you. What time is it there now?
It's a little before 9 o'clock on
Before
Tuesday
nine.
morning.
Okay. So my first question is, why is there such a widespread of anti-Semitism in different parts of the world? Why anti-Semitism? Let's start with that question. Why anti-Semitism?
Okay, it's not an easy question to answer. There's not a single
That's
answer
why
to
we have
that,
you here. Yeah.
right? So I'll have to explain a few things. First of all, I think it's important for people to know that Jews are a tiny minority of the world population. Right now, they're 0.2%. Not 2%, 0.2% of the world's population. And even in places where we see a majority, or a larger population of Jews, like in the United States, it's still only 2.5% of the population. I think when times are bad in societies, it's common to look for a minority group to blame, right? When we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk about scapegoating, and scapegoating often picks a group of people who are a minority, who seem like outsiders, or maybe who seem to be doing better than others in a bad time, and blame them for the world's problems. That's one reason. Scapegoating is a very important reason for anti-Semitism. But then I think the other really key idea to understand about anti-Semitism is that it functions as a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are very attractive to people. They can be seductive to people. And anti-Semitism, when I say anti-Semitism operates as a conspiracy theory, there's a notion or an idea of secret Jewish control, that somehow there's a small group of Jews controlling fill in the blank culture, politics, finances. And in an increasingly complicated world, conspiracy theories, which provide simple explanations, are very attractive to people. We could talk more about how these conspiracy theories actually go back centuries.
Yeah, let's talk about it because anti-Semitism is not something new. It has existed for centuries. And I'm just wondering why Jews? Why Jews were targeted more than many other groups, or
Well,
more than all other groups, maybe.
one of the reasons is that if we're talking about hundreds of years ago, there were efforts to convert Jews, especially by Christian majorities in many societies, and Jews who would refuse to convert. That would sometimes perpetuate hatred against that group. I think if we go back, say, to the medieval times, right, you see two important conspiracy theories about Jews that take hold in really powerful ways. One is the lie that Jews killed Jesus. And that notion, which is incredibly powerful in Christianity, is written into their religious texts at the time, perpetuates hatred of Jews. And then another is this notion of the blood libel, that it's a lie. And I think one effective way to think about anti-Semitism at its base is lies told about Jews. So this lie is that Jews need the blood of Christian children for Passover, for their Passover ritual. Passover is the holiday in the spring that celebrates Jews' freedom from slavery, and that Christian children's blood is needed for matzah, which is a key food in the Passover holiday. So this idea that Jews are kidnapping Christian children and killing them for their own ritual also takes hold. So both of these are conspiratorial notions about Jews that perpetuate hatred of Jews. And again, you have this small minority that sometimes lives apart and that insists on living apart and not assimilating into the dominant society. And that can perpetuate hatred as well.
But is it also the fact that because of discrimination, because of these lies, Jews were marginalized, but at the same time, because of their cultural values, because they valued education, they educated themselves, they became successful in different societies. So, for some people who were not as successful as Jews in those societies, this hatred somehow intensified because they saw this minority who were discriminated against becoming very successful.
I think that's right. I guess what you're talking about, Mazir, is resentment, right? There can be a resentment of Jews that leads to hatred of Jews. I think one of the things to recognize about what you're saying, though, I mean, I agree with you, and that paints Jews all with one brush. And Jews are not a monolithic group. You have Jews who are successful and you have Jews who are poor throughout history, right? But the image of Jews by the dominant society becomes an image or an imagination of all Jews somehow being successful and all Jews being loyal to each other first, not to the lands in which they live, right? So another factor that perpetuates anti-Semitism is this notion of dual loyalty, or that Jews' real loyalty is to each other, and not to the societies in which they live. But I think we do have to be careful about lumping all Jews together, right? And I when
You
I'm
have
when
to be careful, but the average conspiracy theorist or average anti-Semite who may not be educated, who may have very little educated, they don't care about being careful. And because of that, they put two and two together, and Orwell, as Orwell says, the result is five.
I'm always wary of any statement that begins with all Jews and then fill in the blank. But we see that a lot of anti-Semitism does function that way. And Nazi anti-Semitism during the 1930s and 40s in Germany certainly functions that way. All Jews are our enemy, or the common phrase that Nazis would use, Jews are our misfortune. So what does that do? It sets up an us and them. Jews are here in Germany, the Nazis are saying, but they don't belong here. They're not us. They're an internal enemy. And anti-Semitism often functions by identifying an internal enemy and blaming that internal enemy for all the problems of a society. Right. What happens in Nazi Germany in the 1930s is a racial anti-Semitism, a notion. So, you know, Jews are a religious group. They're an ethnic group. They're a cultural group. It's hard to pin down and define Jews, and Jews will disagree among each other about the how to define Jewish identity. Anti-Semitism had been based on religious prejudice against Jews. The Nazis make it a racial prejudice against Jews. Literally, they believe that it's in Jews' blood. Someone is Jewish because of what's in their blood. Um, Nazis will believe then that Jews are weak and diseased and parasites, attacking the host society. And if you think about it, if Jewish identity is racial, then even Jews who say convert to Christianity, which some Jews do, according to the Nazis, are still Jews in their blood. And they believe that Jews are a diseased part of society, an enemy within that needs to be eradicated. And so that racial anti-Semitism is one of the biggest differences, or I guess you could say, an evolution of anti-Semitism in the 1930s.
And that racial anti-Semitism, of course, precedes the Nazis. But was that something, a belief that was widespread in around Europe, or it was very specific to Germany and the area around that? country.
You're right. It's this belief, this racial anti-Semitism and a belief in a racial hierarchy of groups of peoples is not unique to Nazi Germany. We see it here in the United States. We see it in Great Britain. We see it elsewhere. At that time, a kind of racial science, eugenics, that takes hold in multiple societies that ranks groups of people according to a hierarchy of how, quote, civilized they are. And you see in those rankings, white Christians and usually white Christian Protestants at the top of this ranking of hierarchy, and Jews and other, we would today say people of color at the bottom of that hierarchy. And the notion was that those people are weaker, that they have traits, biological traits that should be bred out of society. Um, and it speaks, Mazir, to one of the contradictions of anti-Semitism as well, right? Jews are at the bottom of that racial hierarchy, but they're also imagined as a powerful group. So they're weak, and an anti-Semite will tell you Jews are weak and they're powerful.
And the other, I think, or maybe the most despicable form of anti-Semitism is denying the Holocaust.
Mhm.
As a Holocaust historian, how do you feel when you hear someone denies the Holocaust? And then again, as a Holocaust historian, how can you prove that Holocaust really happened?
I mean, I feel concerned, and honestly, sometimes I feel sickened when I hear people deny the Holocaust. We have so much evidence of what happened, and so much of the evidence of the crimes is from the perpetrators, from the Nazis. The Nazis were proud of what they were doing, so they were documenting it. And so to deny that, I mean, the Nazis sometimes tried to hide their crimes from the world, but they're also proud of what they're doing. So we know the Holocaust happened in part because of the evidence we have from the Nazis. We also know from the survivors, from Holocaust survivors. And so you asked me how I feel. I mean, part of the reason I do this work is because I've had the privilege to know so many Holocaust survivors. And I want to make sure that their stories are carried on and that their experiences are carried on past the moment of their lives. And we're living at a moment right now, 80 years after the end of World War II, where we soon won't have eyewitness testimony. So I feel a deep obligation to continue teaching the Holocaust. You ask why or how people can deny it. I think it actually is a window again into how anti-Semitism works, right? I think much of Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. Scratch the surface of what a Holocaust denier is saying. And often you'll get a denier saying, the Holocaust didn't happen, but then at the same time, they'll celebrate Adolf Hitler, or they'll celebrate what the Nazis did, or they'll say some version of the Holocaust didn't happen, but Hitler should have finished the job, meaning killed all the Jews in the world. That contradiction doesn't make any sense. But we've been talking around this a little, and I think it's important to say anti-Semitism is not logical. Prejudice is not logical. So anti-Semitism contains a lot of its own contradictions. Jews are weak, Jews are all powerful. The Holocaust didn't happen, but Adolf Hitler was a great man who should have finished the project, right? And these contradictions don't, for someone who hates, these contradictions don't bother them.
Yeah. Jews are
And
capitalists, Jews are communists.
exactly, exactly. That's the classic, right? Jews are capitalists, Jews are communists. And I think, one of the frustrating things, I wish I were smart enough to figure this out, but um, if a form of hatred is based on illogic, right, a lack of logic, those of us who try to fight anti-Semitism and try to answer anti-Semitism fight back with logic and with facts and with evidence. But how do you meet illogic with logic in a successful way? It's a problem for fighting all prejudices. Not to say, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. We have to continue to do it. But when people say, well, why doesn't anti-Semitism just go away? Well, it's based on lies and falsehoods and illogic and conspiratorial thinking. And those things are attractive and hard to combat.
Why did you become a Holocaust historian, and why do you think other people should care about the Holocaust?
I became a Holocaust historian 30 years ago. I had my first position at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And I was very young at that time. I was just starting out in my career. I had just finished my undergraduate studies, and I was working in the oral history department of the museum where I was meeting survivors every day and recording their stories. And I felt this deep obligation to um, to try to document these people's histories and to make sure that survivor stories are carried forward. That made it important for me to study this topic. Why is it important to study? I
But
mean,
before that,
yeah,
just want to be a bit more personal. Was
yeah.
there one or two memorable testimonies that you recorded that really affected you that you can share with us?
I mean, there were so many. You know, I remember talking to a woman who um, was on a death march, which is at the end of the war, talking April 1945, or the first months of 1945, the winter, January, February of 1945, as the Soviet troops were coming from the east. There were still prisoners in Jews and other prisoners in Nazi killing centers and concentration camps. And the Nazis, to the end of the war, wanted to make sure they could kill as many Jews as they could. So they sent them on death marches, which was they just started walking them west towards Germany. And the purpose of these death marches was just that people would die on the march. It was cold, it was winter, they had no food. If they couldn't walk anymore, they were either left on the side of the road or they were shot. And I talked to a woman who was telling me a story about one of the meanest older prisoners, another woman in the camp. And this younger woman who was talking to me, her shoes were torn up, right? So she's on a death march in the snow with holes in her shoes. And this older woman who did not survive the death march and knew she was not going to survive the death march gave her shoes to this younger woman. So she had described to me how mean this woman was to all the other prisoners in order to survive. And in the end, she gave up her shoes to this younger prisoner whose shoes were in shambles. It's stories like that um, that stick with me.
And these are the type of stories that Holocaust deniers don't know about.
It speaks to horrible choices that people had to make during this history, right? And we often talk about choices that perpetrators made, and they did. They made choices. Sometimes those choices were despicable, right, or very hard um, to square with human behavior, with humanity.
And these types
But
of details, they really humanize experiences.
right,
Because
right,
saying 6 million is not very personal, but when you hear one person dying and the circumstances, and that's what we're trying to do inside our project. And I think, I don't know if you agree or not, that many Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites, first of all, maybe they've never met a Jew in their lives.
right,
They don't
right,
regard them as human beings. They regard them as Jews, just like an object.
right.
Also, they don't know about these personal stories and personal narratives.
Right. And I think the personal narratives are, as you're saying, are what are so powerful. I had the opportunity to work with a documentary film team, Ken Burns and Lynn Novick and Sarah Botstein, on this on a film about the U.S. response to the Holocaust. And one of the things those directors would say all the time, they were actually quoting an author, Richard Powers. I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but they said, all the statistics in the world are not going to change someone's mind. You change someone's mind with a great story. And I think we have to tell those individual stories. That's what motivates me to continue telling those individual stories about the Holocaust.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to talk about why people need to know about the Holocaust. Why
Oh, absolutely.
taking is important.
Look, I think there's two different levels of this. One is it's one of the most heinous and shocking crimes in world history. And so we need to study why it happened, how it happened, to understand this. Especially, I was talking about choices, right? Nothing that happens in the Holocaust is inevitable. It happens because individuals make choices, right? So, and in this case, individuals make choices that lead to the crumbling of a democracy in Germany and the rise of totalitarianism. They make choices that lead to a murderous anti-Semitism, where in the end, in 12 years, 2 out of every 3 Jews who are living in Europe die. 6 million out of 9 million Jews living in Europe die, right? So how does that happen? We need to understand how that happens. And it happens because of choices that individuals make. It also so that's on a level of just kind of a foundational level. But the Holocaust also kind of reorders world politics, right? And I think for the past 80 years that we've lived, the past 80 years that we have been living in are shaped by some of the outcomes of the Holocaust, the reordering of Europe. International law is redefined in part by the Nazis' crimes against humanity, right? So there's a geopolitical reason that understanding the Holocaust is also critically important.
You must have studied other genocides and other atrocities, such as the one in Rwanda, Cambodia, Bosnia. Why do you think Holocaust is, or do you think Holocaust is unique in terms of its dimensions or the way that it was planned and perpetrated? Or do we even have to talk about other genocides when we're talking about the Holocaust?
I think it's important to put the Holocaust in a context. It is, of course, not the only genocide. We would have hoped, the world would have hoped that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, we wouldn't have genocide in the future. We get international law about genocide I mean, the term genocide is coined by a Holocaust survivor, a Polish Jewish refugee to the United States named Raphael Lemkin, coins this term genocide to describe the crime. Lemkin himself lost, I believe, 49 of his own relatives during the Holocaust. So the Holocaust shapes how we understand genocide um, in the mid 20th century and in the 80 years since. But as a historian, I think it's important. Um, every event, every historical event in some way has unique attributes, but also attributes that resemble other historical events. And I think it's important to do both things, to study the Holocaust on its own terms and to understand how and why this could have happened, and also to study it in relation to other genocides. Yeah.
Unfortunately, some of our audience members and different people around the world, they say that Hitler was a great man and he did great things for Germany. Some of them condemn what he did to the Jews, and some of them liked what he did to the Jews, but still think that he was a great man that saved Germany and he created many great things. What do you tell them? What do you tell those people?
I think I would tell them to look towards Germany today and Germany's commemoration of the Holocaust over the past, or maybe not Germany's commemoration of the Holocaust. Maybe that's not the way to say it. Maybe the way to say it is how Germany has dealt with the memory of Nazism. Uh, they understand, Germans understand that Adolf Hitler um, destroyed Europe, right? We talk about 6 million deaths during the Holocaust, but we can also talk about over 50 million deaths during World War II, right? As a result of Germany's aggression under Hitler and their work with their collaborators across Europe. So you see, I mean, almost immediately in Germany, you see an effort to almost eradicate the memory of Hitler from Germany. There would have been in multiple German towns, Adolf Hitler Strasse, Adolf Hitler Street throughout Germany. Immediately those names are changed. So even on that level, they're trying to remove his name from German. From any place of honor in Germany. But I think Germans have also really struggled with the memory of Hitler and commemorating him in a way as a counterexample of the dangers of authoritarianism, the dangers of fascism. The notion, the false idea that he somehow was a great man doesn't sit well with me when you look at the mass destruction and mass death that his policies and his beliefs led to across Germany and across Europe.
What about the autobahns and the radio, and those things that he basically not created, but he
Yeah.
basically, during his time, there was an advancement in, different technologies.
Yeah, I think so that's a great question, Mazir. I think it's a cautionary tale, right? Um, yes, there's the Autobahn and there's Hitler's use of the very effective use of the radio, right, for propaganda. I mean, we see that also in other genocides in Rwanda as well, right? A very dangerous use of technology. Technology can be used for good or for ill. Hitler is very effective at using technologies. He is in the 1930s flying around Germany in an airplane, right, to to spread his message, right? That's very advanced technology in the 1930s. So it's not the technology itself that either is inherently good or evil, right? It's how human beings use it. And Hitler and the Nazis especially are using the radio to spread hatred of Jews in a way that contributes to their marginalization, their separation from society, and eventually their murder as well.
Many people who like Hitler, who commemorate Hitler, they say that he was defeated finally by the globalists. What do they mean by globalist? What does globalist mean? And was he defeated by the globalists?
I think globalist is a code word for Jews. To me, globalist eh, has that resonance of conspiratorial thinking that is at the center of anti-Semitism. So I think globalist is just often being used as coded language to signal a belief in a secret group, a cabal of Jews. Sometimes this goes back to one of the most infamous anti-Semitic texts, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a false book that imagines that there's some group called the Elders of Zion. This group has never existed, but a group called the Elders of Zion that is secretly controlling the world, everything from international finance to war and peace, right? So I think globalists is a way of talking about Jews without saying Jews, but
But it
it's
also it implies being rootless and
Right.
belonging to everyone and not
Yes.
belonging to one country, which
Right.
a lot of people say Jews are.
Right. It describes this internationalism, right? Hitler was a hyper nationalist, right? It was about Germany's nationalism, and this notion, again, going back to what we were saying earlier about Jews not being loyal to the nations in which they live. Anti-Semites believe that Jews are loyal to each other and not to the nations in which they live. So a globalist has residue of that charge also, that Jews are not loyal to the lands in which they live, can't be trusted, and that are acting for each other rather than acting for the good of the societies in which they live. These are all commonly repeated hateful ideas about Jews.
So, did globalists or who defeated Hitler?
Well, the Allies defeated Hitler. The Allies, led by the Soviets, the British, and the United States, but with many other countries as well, made huge sacrifices at home and wherever home was, whether it was Great Britain or the United States or elsewhere, and in war, right? This is a mass catastrophe with so many deaths on every side, but ultimately it takes a military victory to defeat the Nazis. The Allies are very clear in fighting World War II that they don't want to make the same mistakes that were made during World War One. The Allies felt that the negotiated peace of World War One was a mistake and that they needed a total military victory against the Nazi regime.
When you hear the word, I mean, as you know, in the US these days, especially, but also in other places, many people are talking about globalism and globalists. How do you feel when you think about that? And do you think that these people, they're all anti-Semites, or they have other grievances against capitalism, the system, different systems of governance, and they are using the term globalists as an abstract term to identify the source of the problem, which to them it's unknown. It may imply a cabal of people, most probably Jews, but to them it's unknown. These are the people, it's they who are controlling the world. It can be the system, it can be the government, it can be the capitalists, etc.
Right. I mean, not all conspiratorial thinking is necessarily anti-Semitic, but I'm very wary when I do hear conspiratorial thinking because conspiratorial thinking feeds anti-Semitism. It often feeds anti-Semitism. You might be talking about the people you're talking about, say the hypothetical people who want to know or speak about globalists and want to understand who's controlling things. I think it's just a few more steps down the path, potentially, to anti-Semitism. So how do you stop people from going down that path? I'm very concerned about kind of a triangulation right now between conspiratorial thinking, which is very popular, the way conspiratorial thinking feeds anti-Semitism, and the way that social media is optimized for conspiratorial thinking. And we know that more and more people are getting their news from social media and believing what they read on social media. So I think we're at a moment right now where there's a deficit of critical thinking. And I would, and I think a deficit of critical thinking feeds conspiratorial thinking. Conspiratorial thinking provides simple solutions to complex questions. And I would encourage people to ask themselves when they're reading something, how do I know that's true? How do I know whether that's true? Anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred thrive on lies. And if we can pause and ask ourselves, how do we know that's true? That's a way to combat some of this thinking about anti-Semitism and lies. And I just worry about the people who you would be describing as on a trajectory that's a concerning trajectory that could lead them from um, kind of innocent, uninformed questioning, right, of and then buying into a notion of a global Jewish conspiracy to explain a complex world.
I think it's very important that you talked about critical thinking because one of the reasons I became interested in Holocaust education and
Mhm.
reading about Holocaust and get myself out of my comfort zone, which did not have my comfort zone has nothing to do with the Holocaust or Holocaust
Right.
history, and also working on Holocaust education is to get people out of their comfort zone and empower this critical thinking.
Yeah.
And in essence, I think what when we talked about anti-Semitism, we're talking about a very black and white view of the world, and mostly misunderstanding what is black and what is white, and also identifying a very simple solution to very complicated problems. And
What have
unfortunately,
you seen?
yeah, social media, I think that somehow empowers it. And to tell you the truth, sometimes I think that the Nazis would do really well with social media. If social media existed in the 1930s, I think
I agree.
Nazis would be so successful in using different social media platforms. Sorry, what was your question?
No, I agree. I mean, radio was new media at the time, and the Nazis were quite good at using it. I guess I'm curious, what have you seen or as some of the most successful strategies to move people towards critical thinking?
It's just, I think you have to educate people and expose them to different ideas as much as possible.
Yeah.
You have to question them all the time and also allow them to question their ideas
Yeah.
and telling them that unfortunately, the answers to most questions is not very simple. It's
Right.
not a yes and no answer. And social media does not allow that. Even
Exactly.
cable news does not allow that either.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that is our struggle these days to somehow talk about these very complicated issues, which can benefit people even in their day-to-day lives. And confronting social media and cable news and, very short attention spans. So that
Right.
is our challenge.
Right. Right. I still have optimism that I agree with you about cable news and social media, but I still have optimism about the classroom as a space where you can be in conversation with people who have who may have different ideas and experiences than you, hopefully who do have different ideas and experiences, and to be in relationship with them, over time rather than over, a 15-second soundbite on social media. And I think it's important to set up an expectation in that space to say, we're not here to win a political argument. We're here to think critically and try to understand something. I think so much of what's happening in our public discourse, especially in the United States, is we're in these spaces of social media or cable news to win a political argument. And I don't think we're going to solve the problems we have by only being in conversation with each other in order to win, right? I think we need to be in conversation with each other in order to think critically.
No, it's all over the world. I think a lot of people, they express ideas and they share news in social media, like people, sing in the shower. They
Yeah.
enjoy it themselves and they don't care, about the quality of their voices
Right.
or what they're singing. And I think that's all that's important for them. But unfortunately, unlike singing in the shower, you're sharing it with, thousands of people or sometimes millions of people. And that can have really disastrous consequences.
Yeah, I agree.